Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the National Humanities Center Humanities in Class webinar series. Tonight's episode is titled, How Islam is Portrayed in Comics. I'm pleased to be joined by Marianne Rett, Professor of History and Anthropology at Monmouth University. Today is January the 13th, 2022. Welcome, everyone. My name is Andy Mink. I'm the Vice President of Education at the Center. And on behalf of my staff, Jira and Mike and Meredith, as well as our guests tonight, Professor Rett and Emma Harbour, I want to thank you for joining us. I know this is a severely disrupted year and a part of your career you likely could never have predicted. And to know that you are regularly working with and supporting students of all ages is really inspirational on this end. And we hope that we can continue to support your leadership and your growth, give you some space to have professional conversations around these kinds of complicated topics and ways that you can then bring those to your students. In particular, I want to welcome Tim tonight. Tim's joining us from the Vance Virtual Village Academy. I want to thank Amber for rejoining us. Amber, it's always good to work with you. Amber's in Albemarle County Public Schools in Central Virginia. Elena's down in Southern Pines, North Carolina, not too far from me in my home in Chapel Hill. Brady, I don't think I've seen you in a webinar before. Brady's joining us from Hutto Independent School District in Texas. And of course, we always have a wonderful contingent of Los Angeles Unified teachers, Emily, Lena, Elva, and Rosemary over at Southgate High School. We appreciate you being with us tonight. The center is located in Durham, North Carolina, and we, just as you are engaging with this second half of our academic calendar. Every day is a new day to wake up and wonder how the pandemic is treating us, how the natural weather cycles might be affecting us. But inside that building that you're looking at, there are 36 wonderful fellows from all humanities disciplines who are every single day being very thoughtful about and earnest about the ways that the humanities can improve the world that we live in. And I think one of those ways, and there's many themes and threads that have emerged after 43 years of supporting the fellowship class, but one of those that seems to have consistently appeared and emerged and is part of the conversation is the issue of representation. And I'm very pleased that tonight we can address that directly. Representation, misrepresentation, hearing and elevating and magnifying, amplifying marginalized voices, finding ways to use the humanistic pursuit in source work, in literature, in art, in landscape, in culture, ways that we can use our humanistic lens to really help bring those things forward. And I'm very pleased that, again, tonight we can address that very directly. You'll find all kinds of resources that will support your transition of this content to your classroom in the Open Education Resource, the Humanities in Class Digital Library. As you know, this is a free and open resource platform in which you can find a wealth of materials of both scholarly and instructional nature that you can then have the full confidence in that they're accurate and they're vetted, but also that you can use those in your instruction with copyright permission. This is where you'll find the resources associated with each of our webinars, including tonight's. That includes materials that Professor Rett has pulled together in advance. If you didn't have a chance to read through those or to review those before tonight's session, I encourage you to reflect on the conversation tonight by going back and revisiting those. You'll also find, after a couple of days, the recordings of each session, as well as the PowerPoint that you'll be introduced to tonight. So please do use this as more than a place to just get things. This is a big filing cabinet that provides and produces all of the supporting work, the ancillary work that goes with each of our webinar conversations. One of the advantages of the digital library is that not only is all the material and all the resources that the center makes available there, but also many content provider partnerships from all across the nation in many different disciplines. I'm very pleased to welcome Emma Harbour, a friend and a colleague who is joining us on behalf of one of those organizations, the Duke UNC Consortium for Middle East Studies. Hey, Emma, can you hear me out there in Boulder, Colorado?
Hi, Andy. Thank you so much for inviting us to be part of this program. It's really wonderful to be with you all this evening, and we're really looking forward to Dr. Rett's presentation. As Andy mentioned, my name is Emma Harbour, and I serve as the Director of Outreach at the Consortium for Middle East Studies at Duke University and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Hello to some friends I see in the chat from North Carolina. So glad that you all could join us this evening. Through a competitive grant, our consortium has been designated by the United States Department of Education as a National Resource Center, and we provide reputable and relevant content about the Middle East on our campuses and to the public. Our outreach initiatives particularly focus on working with teachers and schools. And I should note that given the topic of tonight's webinar, our grant is specific to content on the Middle East and North Africa, the MENA region. However, our work through the Center for Middle East and Islamic Studies at UNC does add Islamic Studies content and topics to our outreach programming, such as tonight's discussion. And as Andy mentioned, though we're based in North Carolina, our content, resources, and programs do have a national and international reach. And so I'd like to just highlight a few of the ways in which we support educators in deepening their understanding of and teaching about both the MENA region and topics related to Islamic studies. We provide a variety of professional development opportunities that connect teachers with our faculty's expertise on wide-ranging and interdisciplinary topics. These programs range from summer institutes to full-day workshops to study tours, both locally and in the region. And currently, the majority of our programming is online, so you all are welcome to join us online no matter where you are located. This spring, we're hosting a really exciting series entitled Middle East in Context, and so we're going to be talking about contemporary issues in the region with scholars and really situating those in historical context. I'll put our website in the chat in just a moment so you can follow up and engage with our different programs. And finally, I'd like to highlight our website, which I'll also put in the chat, which is for our outreach programs, ncmideast.org, and it houses a wealth of resources for teaching and learning about the region. On this slide, you can see the kinds of programs we offer for community college instructors, if there are any with us tonight. Notably, we produce a multimedia series entitled The Middle East Explained, which features experts talking about issues on the region related to classroom curriculum. And the videos are just about 5 to 10 minutes long, and they're paired with a discussion guide. And many of our resources can be found within the Humanities and Class Digital Library, so I encourage you to check us out there. Again, I'll put our website in the chat, and I hope that you will visit us and take advantage of our future offerings of professional development and resources on the Middle East, North Africa, and in Islamic Studies. And so please feel free to contact me with any questions. I'll put my information in the chat as well. Thanks again, Andy, for inviting us to be part of this.
No, thank you, Emma, and thank you for sharing these powerful resources. I do hope that everyone in the audience takes a moment to investigate them, both in the digital library as well as the links that Emma is going to drop in the box. One of those collaborations that we do with Emma and her center has been the creation and the design of an online course that does correspond with this notion of better understanding the region and the culture through different kinds of lenses. If tonight's is about comics, then Understanding the Modern Middle East spends a lot of time working with art and music and graffiti to better understand these relationships. I know that many of you join us for our webinars for the credits, the 5 professional development credits you receive. The nice thing about these courses is you can receive 35 credits by participating. We do have our winter sessions opening soon, and I encourage you to take a look and sign up if you're interested. Of course, the webinar series is now well underway in our second half. This is episode 22, I think, of 40. And as I look through the spring and the next couple of months, I see several sessions that will also be in some ways addressing this notion of misrepresentation and representation. That includes our work with Kate Masur from Northwestern on February the 8th. Kate will be, Professor Masur will be working with us on the many different ways that Abraham Lincoln has been misquoted in current political theater. Eric Mueller has rescheduled his fall session for February 10th, and he'll be working with us on the photography of Japanese American citizenship during the mid-20th century. Later in March, Christine Vioria will be joining us from UTEP. Christina will be working with us on how to understand teaching U.S. history narratives by including a Latin American perspective. And finally, the very last session of the entire season, Kristen Haas from University of Michigan will be joining us to work on the ways that memorials are used as representation. Please do take a look at our entire spring lineup and sign up for any that you might find interesting. Share them with your colleagues. We would love to have new faces join us for our webinars. Finally, I'm going to thank one more time our Teacher Advisory Council, including Kate Van Haren, who I see in the room tonight, for their continued and ongoing work. It seems like every time we engage them and they contribute in really critical ways, the pandemic rears its head and we figure out other ways to do it in this virtual environment. I want to thank them for their ongoing connection and engagement and look forward to working with each of them as the year progresses. So before I introduce our guest tonight, I would like to remind you that as an audio-only webinar, there's two things that are very important. One of them is the audio. Hey, Felicia, I hope you found the volume button. It's right there where the number 2 is. It's the volume button underneath the image that you see is being displayed. And so if you at any point struggle with the sound or your Wi-Fi is not working, you can either toggle it there or you can just log out and come right back in. It will not disrupt the session or your documented time being with us. And the second thing I want to remind you of is the importance of your chat. Please do continue to chatter with each other. If you have any formal questions you'd like me to, as the moderator, to bring to Professor Rhett, I'd be happy to do so. You can drop those in the Ask the Professor tab. Again, you have joined us for the Humanities in Class webinar episode titled How Islam is Portrayed in Comics. I'm joined by Dr. Marianne Rhett, Professor of History and Anthropology at Monmouth University. Tonight's TA, a member of our Teacher Advisory Council, is Kathy Keffeler. Kathy's in the Black Hills of South Dakota in Box Elder. She teaches at Douglas High School, and she has collected some additional resources in the library. She'll also be in the chat box asking questions and supporting tonight's session. Dr. Rhett, can you hear me up in central coastal New Jersey?
I can indeed. Thank you. Hello,
Absolutely.
everyone.
Thank you so much for joining. I'm going to give you the reins to the PowerPoint in a moment and allow you to drive us through this conversation. But as is my custom with these sessions, I often like to start with just a sort of a framing question, if you don't mind. I'm going to catch you off guard with an unannounced question. And I wonder if you can set the tone for tonight by talking with us for a moment about this notion of representation and misrepresentation. And specifically, we're all educators, we're all scholars in our own ways. Is it enough to just not misrepresent, or is it really important to represent accurately?
That's a huge question. It's an excellent question, and hopefully over the course of the next hour and a half or so, I'll be able to get at some of that through the examples. I think it is hugely important to represent and represent accurately. But I also think when we're looking at topics like Islam and how it's portrayed in U.S. mass media, we have to understand the context in which it is being produced. An awful lot of what I'm going to talk about tonight is actually from the early part of the 20th century. And the fact that we see Islam, if occasionally, often, poorly misrepresented, is significant in and of itself. The fact that it's there in this popular media is important. That it wasn't there is notable as well. So I think when we talk particularly about comics, we've come a long way. We've got a lot of work still to do, but we can talk about that sort of change over time and how representation has been so crucial to developing a sense of identity, not only for those being represented, but also for the people reading these materials or ingesting these materials, because it gives them a sense of identity as well in this global, environment, community that they're finding themselves in. I'm not sure if I fully answered your question, but hopefully I got us started.
Yeah, you definitely did, and I think it's that kind of framing in the context that you're starting with, I think also, I think it will. I'm anticipating that it will take what you're now about to share and help our audience, think about the importance of always kind of pushing on these buttons, regardless of the content. But that representation is so important, and it's more than just unteaching things that have been somehow ingested, but it really is representing it accurately with a wide variety of instructional choices. Professor, thank you again for joining us. I'm going to give you the PowerPoint, and as the moderator, again, I'll be bringing you questions on occasion. Pause when you need to, and we'll queue some of them up, and we're really looking forward to walking through this with you tonight.
Sounds great. Thank you so much. And welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me tonight to talk about one of my absolute favorite topics, and that is, of course, how Islam is portrayed in comics. As I said in the lead-up question answer, I am going to focus a great deal on the early 20th century in my examples. I will bring us down to the modern age, so don't fear. Kamala Khan will get a look in. But I'm going to dive in and start probably with one of the most controversial figures that we can raise in discussing Islam and portrayals of Islam in comics, and that is, I'm going to start with Muhammad. Before I get into the images, I want to make a couple of points. First and foremost, while iconoclasm is generally an element in Islamic tradition, it is not a universal among all versions of Islam. There are definitely populations and communities that continue even today to create pictorial images of the Prophet and of saints as well, and that they are, relatively speaking, commonplace. These images that I'm talking about at the moment are usually done reverentially, and they're done with the purpose of usually imparting, in this case, religious knowledge to the audience. They are just as much disliked by the iconoclastic factions of the Islamic world as the comics that perhaps you're more familiar with from European political cartoons that have caused quite a bit of controversy over the last couple of decades. Those are definitely not done reverentially. They're not intended to impart a sense of knowledge. The images I'm about to show you, and I just as an FYI, I always introduce images like this with that sort of caveat. The images I'm about to show you are examples, again, from American comics tradition, but they were done largely for educational purposes, that they were intended to impart knowledge. We're not talking highfalutin scholarly educational purposes here, but just the simple idea of imparting a sense of what Islam is or who Muhammad is. Maybe not reverentially, maybe not to further the faith, but nevertheless, they were not done to incite anger, nor were they done to poke fun of either the faith or of Muhammad himself. So with all of that said, the first three examples I have for you here are in some ways sort of stock examples of what we might find when we talk about pictorial images of the Prophet in U.S. comics from the early 20th century. The first that I'm going to talk about is, you'll see on the left, and this is from Uncle Ray's Corner. It was only this single panel, and just as a side note, I cast a very wide net when I talk about comics. It's not just the comic book, it's not just the Sunday Funnies comic strips. It includes these single panel depictions, it includes political cartoons and all of that. Uncle Ray's Corner was this sort of image or illustration tied to some sort of knowledge tidbit that the author felt the audience needed to know more about. Something interesting or amusing, either about history or about the modern world at the time. As far as I'm aware, this is the only one I found in the series that related specifically to Islamic history. But it is very typical of these depictions because it focuses on Muhammad as a camel driver. There is this real deep fascination that comics creators had with the fact that Muhammad's employment before becoming a prophet was as a camel driver. And we're going to see that come up time and again. We can talk about why that fascination may have existed as well if you're interested. The next image I want to do is I want to jump actually to the far right and look at the one from Thrilling Comics. Now, Thrilling Comics was one of the early versions of the floppy, of the comic book. It, like the Uncle Ray's Corner, we see this sort of one-panel comic giving us knowledge about Muhammad. Did you know that Muhammad, the founder of, and this is one of those things that's like nails on the chalkboard, most of these comics are not going to refer to Islam, they're going to refer to Mohammedan religion, which is pretty typical of the day. And so it's just one of those caveats that you also have to make when you're looking at early 20th century anything talking about Islam, to be honest. Again, we see this focus on his employment as a camel driver. The middle image, however, is, to my mind, a far more interesting image to get at because it's one panel that comes from a set of pages detailing the history of the founding of Islam. It comes from a 2-volume series, Picture Histories from World History. Picture Stories from World History, excuse me. It was a very short-lived series, only these 2 volumes, but Islam and the rise of Islam and the spread of Islam does get some decent coverage in this, along with, Alexander the Great and Genghis Khan and sort of these other sort of important figures in world history. All right. What's interesting about the Picture Histories, the Picture Stories comic book is that it's actually not the first. A lot of people will look at comics, particularly history comics, and say, oh, this is the first time we're actually seeing history comics being produced, but it's not. If we go back to the 1920s, we actually see a great deal of history comics being produced for newspapers around the country. And one that is very close to my heart right now is this series, Highlights of History, which was written and drawn by J. Carroll Mansfield. It was syndicated throughout the United States, in Canada. I've even found it as far away as Australia as well. It was a series that covered history. The vast majority of Mansfield's work was focused on U.S. history. I have to be pretty upfront about that. But he does spend a great deal of time, this 20 years that he's writing these strips, doing a decent amount of work in what we would call world history. In one of these subseries of world history, he details the history of the founding of Islam and then the spread of Islam later on. Here you're seeing the first page, the history of the Prophet Muhammad and the founding of Islam. There's a lot of things that we can talk about in these particular comics, but for now I'm just going to highlight one of the strips within, the set of panels within the larger work. What I find particularly interesting in Mansfield's coverage of Islam is that not only does he tell us about Khadija, Muhammad's wife, which isn't unusual. We get a lot of coverage of the fact that Muhammad married this rich widow, but he names her. And he names her in the set of panels above this line. But he not only names her, but if you look in the 4th panel on this particular strip, you see too that he says Khadija is the first convert to Islam. And this is a point I really stress when I'm talking about the rise of Islam and the birth of Islam with my students, that Khadija really believed in what Muhammad was saying before Muhammad even did. He was so shaken up, and she accepted it. She was the foundation of faith. And I think it's really important not only that we get Khadija's name, that we get her role as that first member of this new community, but that we also get her as a woman, as a representation in historical narratives like this. Now, I can find lots of fault with Mansfield's works, and I'm going to show you some more examples as we go. But I think it's really interesting that we do get narratives not only about non-white, non-colonial powers in his work, but we also get a fairly decent treatment of women, women of color, men of color, and other groups being represented in this sort of world history.
Professor, I've got a quick question
Yeah.
for you before you move on. This comes from Mindy. Mindy's in Santa Cruz, California. And I mean, you've touched on this a little bit, but I wonder if you can be a little bit more explicit about who the producer of these panels so far have been and who the intended and perceived audience would be.
Excellent, thank you. Yes. So J. Carroll Mansfield is a cartoonist who is living and working most of his life in the greater DC area in the 1920s and 30s. At some point in the 1930s, 1940s, he moves, it looks like, to Atlanta, and he continues to work there. This series, Highlights of History, runs for, as I say, about 20 years, between 1924 and 1942. And it was intended for newspapers, and as I say, it was syndicated across the country. But what's really important here is it was also intended to be read and gathered by school students and brought into classes, high school history classes, to be taken apart, discussed, and used in high school curriculum or in various educational settings. And we know that because there's advertisements in newspapers all over the country saying, hey, teachers, we're starting this new series. You definitely want to make sure you get your students to read this strip, maybe even collect it into scrapbooks. And actually, the archives are full of kids having done that, collected these into scrapbooks.
That's fantastic. Thank you. One more question that might, again, put a little bit of a finer point on this. This comes from Lizzie in Kerrville, Texas. And she's wondering if you can contextualize this on the timeline of 20th century history. So far you've mentioned, 1920s, 1930s, 1940s. How did that sort of world global context play into the intent of the artist and the work?
That's a really good question, and I'm not sure I can give as good an answer as I would like to. This one in particular, this series in particular, is produced in about 1927, even though the date of this particular citation is from 1928. They weren't always printed at the time that they were produced. It is, I think, an interesting statement that he is doing world history strips, a series of world history pages, essentially, in the 1920s. This is, of course, in U.S. history, this moment of internationalism. There's a great deal of interest coming out of World War I in the world in which the U.S. really finds itself. And I don't think that's a mistake, that is what he's focusing on. His earlier strips are much more focused on U.S. history, very specific, very traditional, age of expansion, age of exploration, revolutionary history, Civil War history. And then by the 1920s, it's taking on this more global bent. And later on, I've got some further examples that will also discuss this sort of context of these comics and what they might be saying to the audience as they're reading it as well.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. We can move forward now, but I think it was nice for you to now place that in both the chronological as well as the the intended audience context. Thank you.
Absolutely. I'm always happy to talk about Mansfield. And I will continue to do so actually in this next example here. This is the one that follows up after the rise of Islam, or the birth of Islam and Muhammad. We have the quote unquote Mohammedan conquests in the next issue. These are, as this episode, as you would expect, is in line with the way the expansion of Islam would have been discussed in textbooks at the time. A lot of by sword and by Quran in one hand, and in the other sort of language. But again, there's a little bit more complexity here, because at the top of that page, we actually get a little discussion of what's going on in Islam. Here we have a discussion of some of the pillars, not all five. He leaves out the Shahada for some reason, but he does discuss, almsgiving. He discusses prayer. He discusses fasting during Ramadan and going on pilgrimage or Hajj. So he is imparting this knowledge about, these are the pillars of faith. These are essential to somebody who is Muslim, and that is probably fairly new knowledge to the vast majority of Americans. The number of Muslims living in the United States in the 1920s is not huge. Probably in the, if we're really lucky, tens of thousands, depending on who we ask and how we identify those people. But what's interesting here is that he is able to sort of introduce Islam in a fairly, even-handed way through this comic. The rest of the comic, as it talks about the expansion, like I say, it does kind of fall back on some of those tropes that we would expect in histories written of the era, or at the time. A lot of conquest by sword. We're going to have the battle between the Franks and the invading Islamic forces in France and in Spain. But he does talk about the establishment of Islamic Spain. And then at the end, at the bottom there, we see he talks about how this expansion of Islam brought some very important changes to Europe. In particular, the Arabic numerals, science and medicine, advances in metallurgy, and even paper. And he talks about how crucial this is to sort of that larger narrative of world history, and particularly the development of the relationship between Islam and Europe. The next slide I've got for you is from a series called Your History, and I'm going to contextualize this one a little bit too. So Your History was produced for the Black press, and the "your" involved in this is for those of African descent living in the United States. There were two comic series that were focused on history at the time. So there was Your History on the one hand, and what histories omit, what American histories omit, which also ran at roughly the same time. Your History was largely single panel in its production, and it focused on important personages in African and African diaspora history. Muhammad gets a look in, as do a number of other key players in Islamic history in this series over the course of its production. What's interesting to me is that the question of Muhammad's racial identity is not questioned, right? You would sort of expect that Muhammad would be identified as Arab, but in this particular strip, he is brought firmly into the Black diaspora and identified as having a skin tone like a person from sub-Saharan Africa, a very dark skin tone being black. That is interesting in and of itself. But then when you read on in the blurb underneath, there are other ways in which the authors situate Islam in the global context of the day. And I don't have this, to point to an evidence to back it up, but I suspect that this is being influenced by, or is therefore influencing, the rise of the Nation of Islam. Because there's a lot of emphasis in this particular panel and in the other ones that deal with Islamic history in the sort of great narrative that Islam arrives in Asia and Africa and brings with it sort of freedom and emancipation for those peoples. In particular, a lot of emphasis on the importance of how Islam is the dominant faith, particularly still in places like Africa as this is being written. So it's very interesting to see these two narratives happening roughly the same time. I mean, they're about a decade apart in this particular context, but that we can see representation and portrayal diverging in these ways, in large part probably due to the intended audience. These comics don't just focus, obviously, on Islam or on religion, but they do bring other characters and other moments of Islamic history to the audience over time. And another example of this is both your history and highlights of history cover the Mahdi and the rebellion in the Sudan. For those of you who aren't familiar with this, this takes place in the late 1800s, and it pits Sudanese forces against British forces. And we see the Mahdi extolled in your history as this brave fighter who stands against the English colonial forces at odds of small numbers on the Sudanese forces against the great power of the British Empire. Highlights of history, Mansfield's version is definitely more sympathetic to the British cause, and in fact he even uses this phrase, the fanatic Muslim followers of the Mahdi, which would have been pretty common in mainstream media in how the Mahdi and his followers would have been referred to. And this, speaking of sort of this depiction of fanatic Muslims, you may be wondering if the assassins or the Hashashin ever get a look in. And they do in one comic strip. And unfortunately, I don't have images for you to share with you tonight, but there is this one comic strip that I have found, and it's actually titled Public Enemies Through World History. And they pull out the assassins and detail the history of the assassins in much the same way you would expect, that we get the word assassin from a corruption of hashish, whether or not that may be true. The physical depictions that we see in these comics are very similar to the ones that we see in Mansfield's work. And we see sort of a tongue-in-cheek use of prophetic calling in talking about Hassan Sabbah's rise to power, in the idea that they don't take it too seriously, but that he was essentially just a terrorist, and his followers were just ruthless terrorists of the age. So that that sort of trope of the Muslim fanatic is emphatically embedded both in these historical comics, but we're going to see in other more fictionalized ways as well as we go. Oops, I went way too far there. Sorry. The next slide. There we go. One of the other ways in which we see. Why?
Sorry, that's me. You and I are working over each other. I apologize. So
that's okay. Did you need me to go back to something?
No. I was trying to help you out because I saw that something was highlighted, and you and I were both doing it at the same time. My apologies. Okay,
not a problem. Okay. So this next comic is actually from Puck, which is the humor magazine of the early 20th century, late 19th century, very similar in design and scope to Punch, if you're more familiar with that. Puck takes on, depicting and portraying Islam a couple of times over the years, in particular in their coverage of the acquisition of the Philippines, and I can talk more about that later if you'd like. But here we have Puck's suggestion to the Congress of Religions, which takes place in the late 1890s, and we see all the world's religions sort of personified in these characters or caricatures in front of the gathering spot. You can see Islam portrayed in the right-hand side of the image. This sort of, he looks very grumpy to me, beturbaned, bespectacled man wearing a green tunic. He is the personification of Islam, is the way in which Puck is presenting it. And this gets us at some of the ways we have to read comics of this era when we're looking for Islam, is that it's not always spelled out like the examples I've already given you where we're talking about Islam. Instead we have to look at the clothing choices. We have to look for certain iconography or certain settings or things like that in the background or in the way in which the characters are being presented for us to know, okay, this was intended to be an Islamic character, and then take from that, how is Islam then being portrayed?
Quick question,
Yep.
Professor. Let's go back to that slide 30. This is from Lisa, and we sort of throw out these allusions, but she'd like to clarify the name of this magazine is Puck, and of course that's a reference to or an allusion to the Shakespearean character. That's correct?
Yep.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that magazine?
Yeah, so Puck it's very much like Punch or Mad Magazine, I guess, in more modern era. It's this illustrated history, and Puck actually, if you see in this image, is being depicted by this little almost childlike character. Puck is, the magazine is named for the Shakespearean character that we see, the sort of mischievous
Yes.
character.
Great question, Lisa, and thank you, Professor.
Yep. And then moving on. So as I was saying, it's not always spelled out for us how Islam is to be identified. And this next example is from a series which is problematic for a variety of reasons, but was fairly popular in the 19-teens. And this is from the Sambo series, or Sambo and His Funny Noises, as it was sometimes called as well. In this comic, Sambo and his friends are attempting to get food, and they are offered hospitality by this Arab Bedouin character. We're led to believe that this person is Arab or Bedouin essentially because he's in a tent. This fits with the sort of tropes of the day. We see that the Arab man says that he's going to offer him this hospitality and that we'll eat as soon as he first bows down to the sun before eating. And this is an extremely common misconception of Islam. Honestly, I've heard it in the modern world. I've heard it in my lifetime that what Muslims are doing when they pray is that they pray in the direction of the sun. And this is, of course, not right. But it was a common enough misconception that it finds its way into the popular media of the day. And as a result, it's informing the readership of, oh, this is what a Muslim must do. Of course, the Muslim character turns violent when his hospitality is abused by Sambo and his friends, which is ultimately adding to some other tropes that we see in the depiction and the portrayal of Islam during this time. I will pause here before I move on to the next slide. If there are any questions that you want to...
Yeah, we do have a few questions that have come in. This next one is from
Okay.
Teresa in Alpharetta, Georgia. And she's wondering if you can talk a little bit about the archives you find this work. I mean, you've done a great job of curating these images and now contextualizing for our audience, but where do you find all these?
Well, when I first find them, it's just luck. But in the information that I shared that you can access through the database, there is a bibliography that includes everything that I'm talking about tonight, but also a lot more to give you lots of material to pull from. But the two archives that are by far the best for me are Chronicling America on the Library of Congress's website. And what's wonderful about that is that it's accessible to all. And then also, I have found actually newspapers.com to be an extremely useful database as well. Unfortunately, you have to have a subscription to that one, and so that can be a little tricky. And honestly, the fun thing about comics is once you find one and you learn the pattern of how the comic was produced, so some of these are weekly, some of these are daily, then once you find one, you find a bunch. So that's really the narrative there for most of these examples.
Great. One more question before we move on. This
Sure.
comes from Rainey in Raleigh, not too far from me. And Rainey's wondering if you can maybe make visible your process as an historian when you look at sources like this. So I'll reframe that a little bit and say, what are the first 3 or 4 or 5 things that you ask of or interrogate a strip or a cartoon or an image like this? What do you look for? What are the key questions to be asking?
So when I'm looking specifically, say, for depictions of Muslims or Islam, I'm looking for those tropes that I know would have been there. And I have to say that in the process of doing this work, I've learned about a lot more tropes that I didn't know existed. And so, I try and keep an open mind and sort of, it's the same process as creating a keyword search that you want to look for lots of things. So when I'm glancing through a comic, I'm looking for those visual clues. Arab dress, harem pants, scimitars, which I will talk about later, and other sort of visual identifiers that will allow me to say, okay, this I can look at a little bit more thoroughly. Then, once I'm actually sort of looking at it, I want to know how the comic, well, first off, what is the comic telling me? And my next question is, and it's sort of the follow-up is, if I'm a reader in 1911, what do I learn from this comic? What is my takeaway? So, if I'm reading the Sambo comic, there's a lot of takeaways that I might be able to use in my building a sense of self and identity. And I'll give you some more examples of that as I go along. But a lot of the questions that I ask of these comics essentially have to do with identity building.
Yeah.
And, you know, so.
Great. One last question. I'm sorry.
Sure.
I think this one actually is appropriate for this slide in this image. This comes from Steve, just outside of Baltimore, Maryland, and he's wondering how you, as an educator, I know you're working with college level students, but how do you introduce problematic resources like this one that portrays Sambo as the primary character? Do you avoid it, or do you introduce it with a particular set of guidelines, or how do you do this as a teacher?
Yeah, no, definitely don't ignore it. That causes more problems than solutions. Much like I did when I started this and introduced the Muhammad depictions. You know, I do sort of a preamble, like these are not, you know, in the case of Sambo, this is not a depiction that is, you know, acceptable in today's world for a variety of reasons. However, we do have to understand what drew the creators of this comic to depict, in this case, Sambo the way he does. Sambo is, of course, you know, a good example because there's a history there, right? We can talk about the history of the Sambo character and how he was drawn when he was first published. And then from that, we can develop a discussion about minstrel tropes and other depictions and other ways in which African Americans were depicted and portrayed at the time. So absolutely, I try and very much forefront any sort of depiction like this as much as I can. You know, there's going to be times that I don't see something. And so that's the other thing, is that I try and make a very open community in my classrooms that, hey, I'm going to miss things. So if you see something, tell me what you see so that we can break it down. I don't want to ever go into these classes being like, oh, I know everything about this comic, because inevitably that's a sign that I don't.
Great. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, as the moderator, I'm also the timekeeper. I'll remind us we have about 35 minutes.
Yep. I'm going to sort of jump around a little bit more. I want to talk about one other trope that we see a lot of in helping us identify Islamic contexts, and that is the harem. And women in particular. This will lead me into another thing that I'm going to talk about in just a minute. The harem setting is very much a clue. You know, either a veiled woman or the harem is a clue that we're in an Islamic setting or a Middle Eastern setting. And I should have said this earlier, and I'm sorry I didn't. There is almost uniform portrayal assumption that Arab equals Muslim or Turk equals Muslim. There's very little nuance in understanding that there are Christian Arabs and Christian Turks and Jewish Arabs and Jewish Turks and all of that. So we have to work within the context of these comics. So the harem is emphatically one of these places. And one of the ways in which these comics interact with the harem in particular is through the process of harem peeping. It is identified as a space. The harem is identified as a space that is a tourist attraction, and that 9 times out of 10, white, male, Europeans, or Americans, while touring the Middle East, one of the things they're going to do is attempt to bribe a guard or sneak into the harem in order to sort of check it off their tourist must-do list. Here we have Mutt and Jeff both attempting to peek into the harem in one case, and then Jeff is actually ensconced in the harem in the other. We have that same trope again in Jerry McJunk, When he is touring around the Mediterranean and the Middle East, and he bribes the guard to get in, and being an obnoxious, brash American, gets himself kicked out when he's, he doesn't play it cool like he's supposed to. So this idea of harem peeping is sort of embedded in how the West is supposed to interact with the Islamic world. Harems were also useful identifiers for a couple of other reasons. The image in the upper right-hand corner that you see there is actually a depiction, again, from Puck, but this time it is a harem depicting a Mormon family. There's a lot of conflation about Islamic stereotypes and Mormon stereotypes, particularly at the turn of the 20th century, and this is largely due to the practice of polygamy. This is before polygamy has been banned by the Mormon Church, and if there's one thing that the American populace knows about Islam, it's that the practice of polygamy is accepted. So that sort of conventional wisdom, if you will, informed how a lot of cartoonists depict both Islam and Mormonism, and then how they sort of portray that in this very orientalized setting. The image in the lower right-hand corner comes from an article from World War I, in which there's a lot of fear-mongering being put forward that the Germans are on the verge of establishing their own harems and insisting upon men taking multiple wives, in essence, to create more children to fuel the war effort. And of course, it's nonsense, but that idea, the fear of the harem, is also sort of one of these drivers of popular media at the time as well. Conversely, however, the harem has some other places in popular culture as well. So it's certainly used in advertising. The Belle of Nelson whiskey ad that you see here is a direct plagiarism of a very famous Orientalist painting. But there's a lot going on here, even aside from the plagiarism. We have this sort of opulent harem setting with a very clearly identified slave or servant character at the beck and call of these white women. The fact that this is a whiskey or a bourbon, essentially, from the American South, and this is being published in 1882, one suspects that there's probably some lost cause nostalgia embedded in this advertising as well, all wrapped up in this Oriental guise of the harem. Conversely, as the women's rights movement gets underway and women are advocating for suffrage and for political emancipation, we see the harem take an interesting twist, because the harem pants in particular become a symbol of suffrage, because they give women the ability to, stride forward into the political world. And so that image that you see on the right is from a cover of Puck, and it's called The Harem Girl. And it's essentially equating this idea of the harem girl with the new woman, and that, the freedom of these pants is allowing women to step forward. And I can't understate this, that there were laws passed here in New Jersey, where I am right now, that were passed to try and ban the wearing of harem pants in public. So it's interesting to see how in popular culture, the harem held all these different points of tension. Before I move on to the next set of slides, are there any further questions on that?
Yeah, just one question. This comes from Nick. Nick is in Brooklyn, and we talked earlier about perceived audience and who is producing these. What can you tell us about the actual analytics of the user side? Were these comics popular? Were they syndicated? Were they in a lot of publications? Like, how were they consumed?
That's a really good question. And again, it kind of depends on which one we're looking at. Puck was, so let's look at Puck first. Puck would have been, readily available, but it would have been much like Punch for the middle and upper middle classes more than anything. It wasn't, it was a glossy magazine, full color, all that. And so it wasn't a cheap thing. It wasn't something that necessarily you just ran around the corner to buy. Now, that doesn't mean people didn't see it from the lower classes. It might have been handed down, say, after somebody had read it and they handed it off to a friend. And we know that's pretty common with comics in total, right? We know that comics usually get multiple readerships. The newspaper ones, I'm getting a better sense of those. Like I said, with Highlights of History, it was widely syndicated and globally. Same with Punch, that we see Punch being produced all over the world as well. The example of Your History, however, was pretty narrowly syndicated. It was largely, the ones I'm finding are from the Pittsburgh Courier, but it was largely limited to the Black press. There was a lot of interest in the Black press to have comics like that were speaking to their audience. But again, it's significantly more narrow in scope than, say, mainstream United States press. So that's about what I can speak to. Yeah.
Super. Thanks.
Okay. So I'm going to quickly return to this idea that we've come around to a couple of times about how this shapes identity and is shaped by identity at the time. And I'm going to show you a couple of examples. These first ones are from an artist by the name of Howarth, F.M. Howarth. And he produced this strip called Old Opie Dildock Stories. And in the Dildock Stories, which is not easy to say, I will admit, we see this character travel around the world and take part in all these exciting adventures and saving, princes and princesses and bringing star-crossed lovers together and serving in the courts of royalty around the world. He spends a great deal of time in fictionalized Middle Eastern countries in particular. And it's interesting because in this series, the Middle Eastern countries are fictionalized. They don't necessarily carry, the name of Persia or, Iraq or anything like that, which is strange because in the ones that are set in China are identified as such. Now, I will admit that one of the ones you're looking at here, he does talk about the Turks, and we do have the Turkish flag as an identifier in the background. What's interesting to me about what Howarth is doing is that he takes Dildock all over the world, and he introduces him to a whole host of different cultures, and he has them interacting, and they interact largely as equals. There's still sort of a sense that the American, that Dildock is a little, somehow a little better than everybody else. He's the one with the superhuman strength. But for the most part, these are all equals, and that is really interesting when we look at how he changes when Howarth dies. When Howarth dies, W.L. Wells takes over the strip, and Dildock stays home. He lives almost exclusively in the United States. His adventure stories really become sports narratives, a lot of quote-unquote masculine sport stories, as you see here, hunting and fishing and gameplay and that sort of thing. And when you compare the time that Dildock spends outside the United States and inside the United States under these two creators, you see a drastic difference. And I think this is a statement about how Americans were being presented a way of understanding themselves in the world. You know, Howarth is presenting America as a part of the world, not American exceptionalism, right? America as a part of the world and maybe leading it, yes, that's fine. But, you know, that we're all in this together and that we're pulling into the new age sort of together. Whereas Wells separates Dildock from the rest of the world and makes this sort of exceptionalist case. And so it's interesting to see, in particular, the Islamic setting ones, where we see this either coming together and it doesn't matter that we're separate religion or separate culture, we can be friends, we can work together, versus, nope, we don't talk to one another, or if we do, there is a racial or a social hierarchy that needs to be maintained. What's particularly additional to all of this is that before Dildock, Howarth worked for Puck magazine, and in that he produced this one single-page series about how they got rid of the Raja Abdul Khan. This is interesting because Howarth, you know, sets it up in a pretty, you know, stereotypical way. We have this quote-unquote Orientalist despot who the, as Howarth calls them, mugwumps, his inner circle, want to get rid of. And so they come up with this plan. And they come up with a plan to hire him a blonde secretary, a white blonde secretary, who he clearly becomes enamored with. And his many, many wives in his harem, again, being cued in, get upset about this. And he says, well, forget you. And he leaves. And the mugwumps are happy and the wives are, you know, in despair. But what's interesting is, where does he go? He goes to New York. And for the first time, as far as I can tell, this is one of the first times we have Islam brought to the United States and embedded in the United States. If we're going to see Islam being portrayed in the United States at this time, it's going to be in the setting of Little Syria. Another example of this is the Bradys, which was a dime novel series that also came out around the turn of the 20th century. One of their stories takes place in Little Syria. And in this particular storyline, there are a number of Muslim characters. They're identified as Muslim, and they're not just sort of implied as Muslim. They are identified as Muslim. And they both represent the good guys and the bad guys. And one of the parts that I dearly love about this is one of the quote-unquote good guy Muslims is he's on the side of the Bradys. He's helping them hunt down for these bad guys. And they describe him as, you know, wearing a green turban while he's in his shop in Little Syria. But when they ask him to go out on this mission for him, he takes the turban off and puts on a derby. And this is very telling. This informs a U.S. reading audience that it's not easy to necessarily identify a Muslim because things like clothing can be taken off and can be exchanged for something else. So all of these sort of stereotypes that the comics and the popular media are relying on to clue people in, we're getting a hint that it's not quite so easy as that, with this nuance that Muslims aren't really different from everyone else. They have a different face, but they aren't physically any different than anyone else. Oh, I'm going to take a breath. Are there
take a breath. Well, you know, there are, but you know, Professor, I'm going to save them till the end. We've got about 15, 16, 17 minutes left, and I know you've got several more really interesting topics to get through. I will remind the audience, though, that The PowerPoint you've provided will be available in the digital library, and that does include some bonus slides that you haven't been able to get to tonight.
Yes, there definitely are, and I'm going to skip a bunch of them. We can kind of talk about World War One and the portrayal of the Ottoman Empire and of how Orientalization was used. But I think let's get to the modern stuff. I did promise you some modern examples, and I can't talk about Islam and its portrayal in comics and not talk about one of my favorite characters, and that's Kamala Khan, or Ms. Marvel. So Ms. Marvel is probably the most identifiable Islamic character in the comics world today. And when she was initially introduced, the initial writer was G. Willow Wilson for the series. And she herself is a practicing Muslim as well. And what I find really interesting about Wilson's work on Ms. Marvel is how she infuses a sense of not only of Islam as being, everyday, nothing necessarily special or exotic. It's just very much part of how Kamala Khan lives, but how she also brings in the complexity of feminism, particularly Islamic feminism, into the discussion. And we see, Kamala grapple with identity in so many ways and how she needs to conceal her identity because she's a superhero and that's what superheroes do. But at the same time, there's this pressure, should she veil because she's a Muslim? And in some ways that's concealment, but yet that's also an outward identifier, as we've discussed, and I'll discuss a little further in a second. She's a teenager. And so she's grappling with those, which things do I talk about and which things do I keep to myself, that all teenagers grapple with. She's the daughter of immigrants. And for those of you who either are yourself children of immigrants or are surrounded by children of immigrants, you know that there is a lot of that struggle of identity. What do you share with the world, and what is meant for the family? What is kept private? So all of those sorts of questions are embedded in what Kamala Khan represents, and I think this is why she's so important in these conversations about representation. But a side story within her story arc is that between her sister-in-law, Taisha, and her best friend, Nakia, who have sort of this ongoing dialogue about Islam and about the role of women in Islam. And this two-panel sequence is one of the best ways I have found to introduce the discussion around nuance and complexity about hijab wearing and what the purpose of the hijab is. Nakia, who does wear, who does veil, is saying, well, who knows what the Quran meant? All the Quran says is to, that you should gather your garments around you so that you can be identified. And she says to be identified as a Muslim, which harkens back to what I've been talking about, that the veil becomes this identifier of Islam. And that women, by extension, have to sort of carry that burden of always being the outward projection of Islam. Whereas Taisha is very frustrated with what she sees as the secularization and commodification of the hijab, and that she wants to see women, take on the veil because of their sense of faith, that she feels that it's lost its religious purpose. And I love that here we have, superhero action taking place all around them, but we have this very intense, complex, nuanced discussion about feminism, about Islam, and those intersections that evolve from it. there are a number of other very strong female Muslim characters that we see from comics and comic-related media. We see, in the Captain Marvel, Captain Britain series, we see a Pakistani British woman who's also a medical doctor being able to wield Excalibur, which is this fusion of sort of New Britain and mythical old legendary Britain into this particular storyline. You have characters like Dust from the new X-Men who are problematic, and we can talk about that as well. But nevertheless, it was a first attempt, as it were, to bring more female representation, more global female representation into the X-Men sort of universe. I'm going to skip over Kahra for just a second, and then of course there's the Burqa Avenger, who, going back to this question of concealment, this is a Pakistani cartoon animated series. She conceals wearing the full burqa while she's in superhero form, but she wears, a simple tunic and pants with maybe a shawl when she's not, when she's just an everyday teacher. So there are these questions that are getting played out in all these characters. Kahra is another of my favorites because she is a Cairene webcomic produced in Cairo by an artist who was an art student when she first started doing this. And Kahra fights injustice wherever she finds it, and she also fights sort of assumptions. On the one hand, she fights, the patriarchy and misogyny as she finds it on the streets in Egypt, but at the same time, she's fighting against white feminism. And in particular, she personifies this on Femmen, this webcomic where Kahra fights against these white feminists, literally members of Femmen, who are there in their minds to save her because she clearly must need to be saved because she's wearing modest dress. And of course, we have to help her, and she's just like not having it. And she's showing us that feminism can take many, many forms in these Islamic settings. I suspect that there's a lot of questions, so I'm going to stop there because I definitely want to make sure that we have time to answer questions. I know I've skipped over a lot of stuff, so I do hope we have lots of discussion.
I think we will, but Professor, you've got a few more slides with images. We've got about 10 minutes. Why don't you go through the next two, and then we'll conclude, and we'll bring all the questions forward.
All right. So the next thing I was going to talk about was the fact that in Ms. Marvel and in a lot of these modern examples of Islam in comics, we see this element of travel. And this harkens back to the Hajj, right? Hajj is embedded in the Islamic practice. And when anybody who goes on Hajj will tell you that it is life-altering. And I think a lot of people would just say that is true of travel as well. But of course, Hajj is even more so because of its spiritual quality. Ms. Marvel discusses this and talks about how you're never really in the same place again. It's a more metaphorical Hajj that she's taking in this process, but she is realizing that there is the multiple perspectives with which we can view the world. And it alters her relationships with her family, with her community, with her coworkers, as it were, and to a degree with her faith. And even more so, we see that in other examples, like particularly Marjane Satrapi's Persepolis or embroideries, where again, Marjane goes off to Europe, or we have characters who have gone to Europe and have to return to Iran, and they're altered by this experience, that they now have a new understanding of their relationship to their communities, to their faith, to themselves as women, and identifying as Muslim women or just as women in general in this new, wider global community that they have found themselves in.
Fantastic. That's really an excellent place to stop and pause and bring some questions forward. Thank you again for narrating the passages you've selected and the strips that you brought forward. The first question comes from Claire, who is in Los Angeles, and she's wondering how the comics, how this work, how particularly I think she means the more modern images that you've just recently shared. How are they perceived in the Muslim world? How are they perceived internationally or globally? It's so hard not to see this through the American U.S.-centric lens. How do other countries and cultures and folks receive this?
Without making too many broad generalizations, it depends on what we're looking at. Now, so obviously some of these were actually from outside. So Kahra, for example, is Egyptian, and it's published in both Arabic and in English. And, it gets backlash just like any comic would, but it's also, really well loved as well, because it speaks to, particularly for women, it speaks to these issues that they're facing on a daily basis, and they wish they had a superhero to help them. Another example that I didn't bring into this for a variety of reasons, but there was a series called the Night Runner series. It was part of the Batman Inc. franchise. Now, this is an American production. For those of you who aren't familiar, Batman is sort of franchising himself out to parts of the world. And in France, he encourages this kid to become the French Batman, Night Runner. He happens to be French Algerian and Muslim. And there was a huge backlash, particularly among American comic book supposed fans, at the idea of Batman having a Muslim sidekick. Like that just couldn't be, right? This was back when we were fighting over mosques near the 9/11 memorial and things like that. But this character, Night Runner, is actually from Clichy-sous-Bois, outside of Paris, which is a intensely immigrant-centric suburb or neighborhood of Paris. And the mayor of this region, declared Night Runner a hero to the community. And I have been told by somebody who happened to be in North Africa, working in Algeria and Morocco, I believe at the time, that she had seen copies, photocopies of the Night Runner series with the dialogue whited out, because it was probably in French or English, and with, the Algerian script written in.
Wow.
So it made a real impact globally.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Next question comes from Tim. Tim is also in California. He's in Encinitas down in San Diego County. He's wondering if you can talk some about the distinction between the author and the artist of these comics. They're not the same in most cases, and the artist has a very, very important role in depicting and representing what the author is then trying to say. Can you speak at all to that relationship in these images?
Yeah, actually, for almost all of the examples I gave you, they were the same.
Interesting.
Yeah. Now that's not true of Ms. Marvel, right? There's a whole team of artists involved in the production of Ms. Marvel, as well. And the other example, just thinking back that I gave you that wasn't is your history. That was there was an author and an artist, and from what I have read, they worked pretty well together for a while.
Yeah.
But that they did come to creative differences at various points. But
Interesting.
for the most part, most of these examples I showed, the author and artist were the same.
Interesting. Thank you. Last question is going to go to another Tim, but this Tim is in Vance County, North Carolina, just on the eastern side of Raleigh. And Tim is wondering if you can suggest ways that teachers, educators can use the examples you've shared to disrupt historic and present day Orientalist assumptions.
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously, I think Kahra does an excellent job of that, speaking to these assumptions that we have about feminism, that we have about Islam, not just the example I showed you, but some of the other examples do so as well. I think things like the depictions of Muhammad, I think, are useful too. And I would obviously couple those with other depictions of Muhammad and in showing that there's a wide diversity in ways in which people have come to visualize Muhammad. The other big thing is probably also bringing in discussion of the harem. You know, you have to really delve into what the harem is. And the harem is essentially just a space inside a building, right? In a palace or in a house that is the private quarters of the family. It's not for public consumption. But in the West, of course, it comes to be this sort of place of eroticism and exoticism. And so you start there and say, this isn't what it is. Yeah. And then you use these images and deconstruct these images and talk about the role of the women in these settings and the other characters. You know, race is a big one in these settings, and how that can be further disrupted or dissected.
And really, I think it's with guidance and the insights that you provided that disruption can occur, and done so through the source work. Professor Marianne Rett, thank you so much for joining us tonight and leading tonight's session.
Thank you. This was wonderful.
I want to thank our entire audience for joining tonight's webinar, and I want to encourage you to follow us on Twitter so you can get updates on future opportunities and future activities that we have planned. That includes our next webinar, which is January the 18th, next Tuesday. I'll be joined by Philip Nell from Kansas State University. And Dr. Nell is going to work with us on how you can break up with your favorite racist children book, in particular with a focus on Dr. Seuss. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Have a great day at school tomorrow and for the rest of this week. Please be safe, particularly here on the East Coast with the big snowstorm coming. We hope to see all of you at a future webinar. Thank you again for joining us. Good night.
العيد العيد وجانا يا فرح